Good morning, everyone. My name is Michele Titolo. I'm a lead software engineer at Capital One in the States, and we just spent a half hour in a pub. I'm about to take you to the stage. If you had asked me any time in high school or college what I thought I was going to be doing with my life, I would have said, I'm going to be working in New York, backstage at a show, and basically living the life on Broadway, but like the cooler stuff behind the scenes, not the acting bit. So I'm here today to talk about theater. I studied theater in college. I don't have a computer science degree, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, and I love and I miss dearly as much as I love software engineering. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I telling a bunch of software developers about anything having to do with theater? And what it comes down to is, if you look back through history, theater is really technology and storytelling. For millennia, people have been telling stories. There are oral traditions that have been discovered that I don't even know how far back they go, but needless to say, it's a really long time. We've had the spoken word, we've had stories. And it wasn't until technology started enabling these stories to be more immersive that theater came about. So theater is all about immersive experiences. You want the people there to feel like they're part of this world and that they're entirely enwrapped and captured in what's going on. We also talk about immersive experiences in technology. We all like using applications that are easy to use, that we don't have to think about, that when you're inside the application, you're not thinking about anything else. Games do this really, really well. And all of this depends on execution. This is something that in software we know is a little inconsistent from application to application, from team to team. But this is something that theater has got down to the minute, because turns out if you're doing a show and you're selling tickets, you can't push your ship date further out. People are showing up on opening night, whether you're ready or not. So they found ways to make sure that by the time opening night comes around, everything is ready, everything is good to go. And in order to create these immersive experiences and to execute properly, especially when a show is going on Broadway, like 10 years, I think the longest running Broadway show was 13 years, where essentially every single night they were repeating the same exact steps and leading to the same great performances. And they did this by creating really strict processes. I know I'm giving a process talk. This is essentially what this is, but it's cooler than that, I promise. In order to repeat successes, you need to know why you were successful. And in order to know why you were successful, you have to try out a bunch of different things. So how you go about doing something, how you go about running a show, how you go about building an app will greatly affect the amount of execution and how well you're going to pull it off. And of course, whatever technology you're using affects what kind of processes you're going to use. Now, when it comes to theater, technology has greatly changed since the ancient Greeks back in 4th century BCE. And over time, this has evolved. It is something that way back in the day, they had very different technologies, which led to very different kinds of processes and different levels of execution, versus now we have things like not supercomputers, but like all those little microchips, and they have computerized bits on the stage, and it's all really cool. But the only way that they're able to do these great performances now is because they let evolution happen, and they learn from what came before them. So I'm going to start today talking about ancient Greece. As I said, this is the 4th century BCE. This is the earliest known theater that happened in the world. And most of Western theater traditions come from, ultimately, what happened in ancient Greece. So let's talk about the kind of technology that the Greeks used to put on their shows. They had these things called periaktoi. They are three-sided triangles that you could put together to form a scene, or you'd paint different sides, and one would be a garden, one would be a city, so that over the course of the show, you could be in 3 locations. Think about the last time you saw a performance today, and you'll know that, I saw Phantom last week. There was probably at least a dozen different locations in that show. But the Greeks, they had 3. And they reused the pieces between each performance because they didn't have digital printing, they didn't have mass production of paints, so all of this stuff was really expensive and had to be really carefully thought out so that they could continue to put on performances without essentially throwing everything away and rebuilding it, which is what they do now. There was also this thing called a god machine. The Greek term is the mechane. And this was really cool because at the end of most Greek plays, there is what's called a deus ex machina. It was a device used to essentially bring the gods in to the shows because the Greeks are all about their gods. And this basically helped create surprise because the Greek theaters were made out of stone. And so if you wanted someone to be high up, they had to climb a set of stairs that had to be built into the theater. Then the people in the audience could see the people walking up the stairs, and so it was just not great. So they built this. It's essentially just a crane, but it had a special Greek name because that's the Greeks. And this was the first time that there was any real significant technology used because they had pulleys, they had counterweights. It was a pretty complicated affair. The last piece of technology was the eklekema. It's a very long word, but all it was a rolling platform. You'd think that this would be really simple, but it turns out it's not. So it's just a little platform that would roll on. They still use these today, especially in lower budget high school productions where the platform will be off stage. You can put chairs, props, whatever on it. It rolls on stage and it gives a different sense of place, even though it's not a full different kind of place. Now, coming from what we know today, this is not particularly technically advanced. They had some wheels, they had some pulleys, they had some painting. But this did lead to a lot of challenges. The first of all was all of the theaters in ancient Greece were outdoors. So you had to time the play so that it didn't get dark. You had to make sure that if it rained, everyone could go somewhere. And everything was literally set in stone because these were stone theaters. Scene changes didn't happen, so that sense of place that you see in a show these days doesn't really change much. You're still going to see the same big stone backdrop. You're still going to be seeing pretty much everything the same, but you have to really rely on the audience's imagination in order to see what's going on. And as I mentioned, these were all made of stone. They usually had big facades in the back that had doorways and stuff, but it was the same. It doesn't matter if you were supposed to be in a forest. It doesn't matter if you were supposed to be in a town. There was always this big hunking stone thing in back of everybody. And because of this, it was really hard to surprise people. Stairways were built out of stone. Doorways were stationary. They didn't have the technology of creating rolling doors. So it was really hard to create that surprise and delight that I know we all like as software engineers, and I know that is a big part of theater. Now, when it came to running a show, this is what was really interesting. So back in ancient Greece, there were no directors. There were just playwrights. They didn't really do shows from playwrights who weren't living. Don't know why. So already you have people wearing lots of hats. Everyone shared responsibilities. It was a small cast. They usually only had maybe a dozen people total working on the show. So if something needed to be rolled on stage, the actors did it. If something needed to be taken off stage, the actors did it. Basically, the actors were, the set crew and the actors, and everyone kind of had to be aware of what was going on. And this worked because it was a really small team. And you could know everyone there really well and trust that this person's going to be in the right place to move this thing off stage, versus today, when you have shows with like 50 people in them, not counting the crew, it gets a little crazier. Now, that's ancient Greece. Now, there was this whole thing called the fall of the Roman Empire that you might have heard of, and a lot of the traditions and knowledge from ancient Greece were lost. So it wasn't until the 16th century, in the Renaissance, going into the Baroque period, if you remember your European history, that the ancient Greek traditions were rediscovered, and it kind of was a resurgence in theater. So they came up with some pretty cool technology, and a lot of what is used in modern theater has its basis in here. So obviously, I said the Renaissance, so you probably all thought perspective. And this was, perspective painting, perspective drawing. It was kind of huge. It also revolutionized theater, because the Renaissance was all about realism. So this is a theater in Venice, the Palladio Theater, and it is built in the perspective style. So kind of like the Greeks, where you could see that front that has the big archway and stuff. But as you go further back, that's actually all real. That's not a painting. Here's a cross-section. So you could see how the stage goes up in perspective. So naturally, this was big. So theaters had to be built specifically with this in mind. But again, we're dealing with static backgrounds with no scene changes. So as much as people liked perspective and they liked the realism, they wanted more. So then they invented this system called chariot and pole, which was kind of ingenious because, remember, this is 16th century. They only had wood to work with. There was no steel, no lightweight aluminum, just wood. So what chariot and pole would do was they'd have giant slits on the stage and a wagon underneath the stage for moving it on and off. This allowed the heavy scenery to be moved really efficiently, and also looked pretty cool because they had these big pulley systems and things moving. But again, all made out of wood, all really heavy, and also very limiting because you couldn't really change what was on the thing, so you still were limited in what you could do. So again, that was cool, but they wanted more. So what they came up with was a new innovation called wing and drop, which is what most theaters use today. These are essentially just painted panels. And they had this because they figured out that instead of stuff being underneath the stage, you could put stuff on top of the stage. And so things would fly in and out. In this picture, you could see that there's some nice hanging things. It was really cool. And this is the basis for the current system we use today called the fly system. There's a really great Wikipedia article on this if you're at all interested in counterweights and holding heavy things above your head. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot of technology, but it made that theater had to change. The way that they were doing shows, the way that the ancient Greeks did shows, couldn't be done again because things had changed too much. So some of the challenges were creating an immersive experience. The Renaissance, the Baroque period that followed, were all about realism and creating the feeling of really being in a place. So some of these innovations meant that was easier because you could, have a city painted panel, have it go away, and have a forest painted panel, and then all of a sudden you're in a forest, and it doesn't look like you're in a forest in front of a city, it just looks like you're in a forest. One of the really interesting things was playwrights actually started changing the way they were writing their shows. Before, when they had static backgrounds, they were like, well, I would like this to be in a forest, but I know it can't really be in a forest, so I'm going to have it be someplace else. This allowed them to have more scene changes, which is what we're used to today, and have a lot of different places where the scenes take place. And lastly, weight, because all of this was made out of wood, and it was very heavy. And you don't really want to be moving heavy things, and if you're suspending heavy pieces of scenery above people's heads, you kind of had to be even more careful. So, what happened when they were running a show? Stagehands were introduced. So starting in the 16th century and even until today, there are people whose job it is to move things around behind the stage. They also, for chariot and pole, used pack animals. So in addition to having to manage all of the people running around, you'd have animals, and then you need to figure out how are we getting animals under the stage. So like theaters had to be modified and built with this stuff in mind, like way beforehand. So it was kind of ridiculous when you think about it, especially because back then it took a lot longer to build buildings than today. So once your theater was built, good luck changing it. It wasn't going to happen. And the biggest change was there was a new role created called the stage manager. If you've ever done theater, this is a role very familiar to you. It's a role that is in charge of running the show. So once the actors are done learning their parts, the stage manager takes over and assigns out tasks to the stagehands, make sure that all the props are in the right place backstage, and they were the person responsible for taking care of any issues that arose during a show. Very, very important person, even until this day. Now for the fun part. Because in the past 100, 150 years, we've seen a technological explosion, starting with the Industrial Revolution and up until today. Unfortunately, the arts tend to lag most major technical innovations just because it costs so much. So I'll get to that, but it takes a little bit longer. So technology-wise, lighting really changed. Before, there used to be these candles and little reflectors at the front of the stage. If you've seen any movie that had a depiction of a stage in like 17th or 18th century, you've seen this. So the first innovation was gas lighting, where they'd had little pieces of gas with fire and it'd be great. But we all know gas is really flammable. So it was a little dangerous. So they were really looking to get it better. Theater fires were like well known in the day for being just very dangerous. But then in 1861, the first incandescent light bulb was used in a theater in London, and that greatly transformed the way that theater worked, because for the first time lighting could be changed. Up until then, you'd have a chandelier over the audience, you'd have a bunch of candles backstage with little mirrors, and that was it. The lights were on for the entire performance. The audience was lit up to some degree. Even if the chandelier was really high, there was still some light. And what we get today, where you have that whole blackout and the entire theater goes dark, people move stuff, and then the lights come back up, and it's an entirely different scene. That wasn't there before. So before, you were seeing things moving in and out. So this was huge in terms of the creativity that different playwrights, different directors could have. The next big innovation was iron and steel. The Industrial Revolution really helped create all these amazing machines. And of course, we all know that making use of metal is what we really, really want to do. But what metal means to theater is that you had much larger set pieces, and you were able to build three-story tall towers that would move and could do all of these amazing things. And then we got motors, and motors moved really heavy things, so you didn't have 3 stagehands pulling on a rope to get a heavy set piece to go into the air. And then we had hydraulics, which is still today only used in like the bigger theaters, so like Broadway, Vegas, if you've ever seen the show Ka, there's this giant floating platform that the hydraulics are so big they had to break through the roof and then built the hotel around it to hide the hydraulic system. So they get really crazy. And then we got electronics, mostly computers, because back in the day when you had your lights, each light was on its own dimmer switch, and then a person had to move the switch physically for different points in the show. So it was kind of a lot of labor, and there were a lot of people, and There were entire unions dedicated to people who would sit there during a show and move the switches up and down at different times before they got computerized lighting boards. So what were the challenges? Because things changed, and things changed fast. First of all, was keeping up with the innovation. In this time period, because people became so much more interconnected, playwrights started writing about things, and then the theaters would have to be like, wait, you want live video feed on stage? How are we going to do this? It's really tricky, by the way. I've done it. Safety became a huge concern, especially with all the fires that happened because of gaslighting, as well as having several tons of metal and wood above your head if you're an actor. Generally not a good thing to have come crashing down. You also had really specialized workers. So there were people that specialized in lights, in sound, in carpentry, in what's called rigging, which is hanging the things. They're all different. And finally, scale. I mean, there are shows on Broadway that have over 50 people in the cast alone, that have many, many more involved in the entire process, where sometimes to put on a show, you might have over 100 people involved. And that's a lot of people. So they needed to figure out how to deal with that. Running a show. So what I'm going to tell you about now is basically what every Western theater uses. There are some theaters in Japan and such that use a different format. But once you know about this, you can walk into any theater and pretty much figure out what's going on, which is awesome. So there are different kinds of teams, and they specialize in different things. There's a lighting team, a carpentry team, a run show team, a costume team, a sound team, etc., etc. Just like we're used to, people group together in specializations. And the larger productions actually have assistants, where you'll have a stage manager and an assistant stage manager. Things like Broadway, they usually have like 2 assistant stage managers. And the thing is, it's not just, someone to run and get coffee. It's stage manager gets sick. One of the assistant stage managers knows everything well enough to run the show themselves. They basically make little copies of themselves, which trust me, you want that to happen because flus spread. Pre-production became a very big deal. When you're dealing with thousands of dollars in set pieces, weeks of rehearsal time, and budgets that go into the millions, making sure that everything goes well is really important. So each team has a lead, a dedicated person who is in charge, who goes to all the meetings. Does that sound familiar? And these people are responsible for getting their requirements and then making sure everything gets done. This happens in production meetings. These start usually about 6 to 8 weeks before the performance, right when the scenery is getting built, right when the budgets have already been finalized. So everyone gets together, talks about the status. The director will suddenly say, I need a hydraulic platform in the middle of the stage. And then the technical director, who leads the carpentry team and all the assembly, would say, no, we don't have enough money for that. That's where this kind of stuff happens. And then we get into Tech Week. If you have any friends who've done theater who talk about Hell Week, this is what they mean. This is a week where all the actors are done, all the music is done, everything's ready, and you practice. It is a week of practice. And why do you practice? Quality assurance. You want to make sure that if the lights need to go out when this person stops singing, that the lights always go out when that person stops singing. If you only have 10 seconds to do a scene change, you need to practice that scene change over and over and over and over again until you get it right. So this is really just about coordination, because there's a lot of people, and you want to allow for as little human error as possible. And then we get into the bigger shows. We'll do previews. So if you've ever tried to buy a theater ticket and it was a preview ticket, that means that, well, we just started doing this, we're not that good at it yet, so we might mess it up so you can pay a little bit less. But previews essentially let you work out all the kinks. So you can find out if the circuit breaker might blow in the third act, or, for example. And all of this is because the technology that's been created in the past 150 or so years greatly increased the complexity of the shows that we're putting on. They are technically more complex. They were physically more complex with more people, more things on stage, more moving parts. And of course, through all of this, everyone maintains incredibly high standards. You do not expect to go to a show and, have the lights come up and there's like half of one scene on and half of another. You expect everything to be executed very well because you're paying patron. So standards haven't gotten lower. In fact, they've gotten higher. But what about software? I just talked a lot about theater and how complexity changes things and how people work together in teams and how in bad situations there's always someone who's responsible for fixing it. Well, those should sound familiar to you. So complexity leads to complexity. As the technology available to theatrical arts changed, the theater itself changed, leading to new ways of doing things that you didn't really have a choice but to embrace because things are changing regardless of whether you like it or not. So you needed to figure out a good way to handle this complexity because these are human problems. They're human problems regardless of where you are. If you're dealing with something complex, it's going to take longer. Responsibility is huge in the theater. It's a lot more hierarchical than a lot of other systems we're used to dealing with as engineers. But the reason that you can go from one show to another show and see a very high level of execution is because everyone knows exactly what they are responsible for, and they are held to that. So it's responsibility and accountability, and that's everywhere, because at the end of the day, everyone is working towards the same goal of doing a fantastic show that gets rave reviews and that impacts people's lives. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. We just saw a fantastic talk on leadership and a little bit management. Being able to work together on a team, knowing how to manage a team, how to dole out work, how to tell if someone has too much on their plate is extremely critical, because if there's only 15 seconds in a scene change and one person volunteers to do 3 things and you know they're only going to have time for 2, chances are you need to step in and say, listen, we need to make sure this works. Do 2 things instead of 3. And management is also really important because you are on a timeline that cannot move and you have a set budget. So you cannot go over budget. There's no such thing as going over budget. A lot of theaters are nonprofits. They don't just have a pool of money to dip into whenever something isn't ready. They have to ship on time and on budget, which is why if you talk to any software engineer who comes from theater, they'll always say, one of the things people appreciate about me the most is I always ship on time. Well, you trained for however many years under similar constraints, except you didn't have a choice. And just like in theater, applications evolve over time. A small, scrappy startup will have people wearing multiple hats. You'll be doing software development and QA. You'll be doing design and project management. And so it's entirely natural, as something gets bigger and more complex, for the process to evolve. This is something that a lot of people resist because it's worked for us in the past, so it must work for us now, even though the code base might be 3 times as large, or there might be some sort of new government regulation you have to conform to, or, I don't know, something might have gone wrong. So evolving your process is really important, especially as the complexity increases infinitely, which is what it tends to do. And obviously, different people's roles evolve. When you start out as a small company, everyone's wearing lots of hats. When you start getting more structured, people start doing different things, different strengths and weaknesses come out, and it's only natural for roles to evolve. As much as we don't like change in this area, It's something that embracing it makes it easier for everyone to deal with. And this is something that theater has very much embraced, because at the end of the day, it's all about the execution. And you want to execute well, you want to execute consistently. And it's something that theater has been able to do. It's something that a lot of software developers, engineers, and companies want to do. Because, well, it's all about the experience. Theater creates immersive experiences. Technology creates immersive experiences. And as those grow more complex, as those get more popular even, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. We want to create great experiences. And to create great experiences, we need to evolve. We need to embrace the change that's coming to us, regardless of whether we want to or not. And I hope that by learning a little bit about theater, you learned a little bit about the kind of changes that can happen. So, thank you.
So you've talked about how the processes evolve in theater, and that related to software development. And as people take on different responsibilities, the teams divide. So how does theater help with this to keep the vision or everybody going to the same goal?
So this is done a couple different ways. A lot of it has to do with the leadership. So if you have different teams all working towards the same goal, it's basically the job of the team leads and the management in charge to make sure that everyone's on board. And it's one of those dynamics that's kind of hard to quantify, even though I've seen it happen so many times. It comes from trust. It comes from respect. It comes from feeling like you're still part of a team. So even if you're just a little grunt hanging lights, that is people's jobs, to hang lights and put the color in them and to put them the right spot on the stage. Even if you're doing that, you have the ability to say, hey, this light is not working right, and then you can raise that and talk about it. So it's kind of just making sure that there's the foundation of trust and respect that goes both ways, and which is there in theater because it's very seasonal. So, outside of Broadway, of course, shows will only run for about 12 to 20 weeks. So you have different crews moving in all the time. So you need to have respect and trust for everyone else you're working with, even if you've never worked with them before. And it's just kind of a base level that everyone has. And I think there's a lot of software developers who, when they see a new person come into a team, they start them at 0 instead of 90. And I feel like one thing we could learn is to not start people out at 0 and be like, this person is here for a reason. I'm going to trust the people that hired this person, that they're capable of doing their job, kind of stuff. Very long-winded answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.